"Who made this coffee?" "The Mafia boss." Asked what he did next changed a single mom life. It was just past 7 in the morning, and the only thing that still held a trace of warmth inside me was the scent of freshly ground coffee curling through the air. The espresso machine hissed in steady rhythm, like a heartbeat trying to keep me awake. Outside, the city of Boston was beginning to stir, indifferent to the quiet collapse taking place within me. Inside the Blue Finch, an elegant Italian café tucked along Charles Street, I had already worked a long double shift. My feet burned like fire, and my mind spun under the weight of relentless worry. Rent was due in 3 days. My father's Parkinson's treatments were growing more expensive by the week, slipping further and further beyond my control. Sleep had become a distant luxury, something I no longer dared to hope for. I moved silently among men in expensive suits, balancing silver trays in my hands, eyes averted. That was how they preferred it. Invisible service, no eye contact, no names, no emotions, just speed and precision. Until he walked in. The air seemed to vanish, like the sudden drop in pressure before a storm. Every conversation fell silent. A chill ran down my spine before I even saw his face. 3 men, impeccably dressed, moving with absolute control. 2 walked like shadows on either side, guarding the one in the middle. But it was the man at the center who pulled every glance in the room to himself. He moved like someone who had never known fear, and the people around him seemed to fear enough for all of them. His name? I didn't know it then, but when his amber eyes locked onto mine from across the cafe, I felt something shift deep within me. A warning, or an invitation, perhaps both. That morning, I didn't just serve coffee. I stepped into a world I was never meant to touch. A world of power, danger, and a kind of love that doesn't ask, only takes. If you're still here, listening with me up to this point, thank you for stepping into this small, emotional world of mine. The story is only just beginning, and what lies ahead will hold even more surprises. Before we move on to the next chapter, don't forget to subscribe to the Dear Single Mom YouTube channel. Give it a like, and share it with someone you care about, so that each day you can return to hear stories that truly touch the heart. Journeys that may seem deeply personal, only to reveal how strangely familiar they are to us all. Where are you listening from today? Leave a comment with the name of your city, your town, or wherever you are in this moment, so we can see just how far this story has traveled and how your heart has found its way to connect with ours. And now, let us return to the Blue Finch, where fate came knocking on what seemed like just another ordinary morning. The Blue Finch opened its doors each day at 5 in the morning, but it was the hour between 7 and 8 that truly came alive. That was when the familiar tide began to roll in, smooth and steady. Office workers from the surrounding Beacon Hill neighborhood, faces I'd come to know without ever learning their names, arrived with the quiet precision of ritual. Each had their own rhythm, their preferred drink, and a silent nod that stood in for a greeting. The cafe sat on a quiet corner of an old street, its large glass windows gazing out onto a row of red maples that blazed each autumn. The Italian tile floor, worn with time yet scrubbed to a shine, the simple oak tables, and the deep aroma of freshly roasted beans all created a space that felt both elegant and effortlessly warm. I had been working there for over 2 years, and could almost predict the footsteps of our regulars. One always arrived early and ordered a sugarless cappuccino. Another came only on Mondays, carrying a thick stack of paperwork and never uttering a word. I had learned how to observe without asking, how to listen without leaving a trace. The Blue Finch moved like a Swiss watch, precise and composed, never breaking the rhythm it had carved out over time. Until that morning, the door opened, not with noise or haste, but with a movement so deliberate it felt as though it had been rehearsed. 3 men entered, separate from everything and everyone around them. They wore suits, but not like the ones I served every day. There was something about them that made the air itself seem to slow. The man in the center wore a long charcoal gray coat and walked with a calm that was almost unnatural. Every gesture was measured, no more and no less than it needed to be, as if chance played no part in his world. I felt the silence ripple through the room. People in line began to look up. One of the baristas behind the counter stumbled over emotion. A woman stirring her coffee paused mid-swish, her spoon tapping lightly against the edge of her cup. The man approached the counter. He didn't glance at the menu. He didn't hesitate. He spoke in a voice that was low and rough, but clear, like the sound of a metal gate sliding open at dawn. A double espresso, hot, no sugar, no milk, no cream. I was the one who took the order. He looked up at me. He did not blink. He did not look away. His amber eyes seemed to cut through the tired shell I wore every day like armor. I didn't know why my heart began to beat so fast. Maybe it was the stillness in him. Maybe it was danger. Or maybe it was the feeling, sharp and sudden, that I had just been truly seen for the first time in months, after being nothing more than a shadow moving through this room. When I handed him the cup, my fingers brushed his. Cold. Not the kind of cold brought by the November air outside, but the kind of cold you'd find in metal pulled from the back of a freezer. He took the cup without a word of thanks, but his eyes never left mine. Then he turned and made his way to a corner table, one that most avoided because of the harsh angle of the morning light. The two men with him remained standing close by, watching, not speaking. No one else approached, no one made a sound. The café did its best to carry on, but I could feel every person in the room watching them through the corners of their eyes, reflected in the mirrors, behind the folds of newspapers, above the glow of their screens. I didn't know his name. No one did. But something deep in me understood that from this moment forward, the Blue Finch would never be the same. And maybe, neither would I. He didn't drink it right away. The espresso sat untouched on the polished wooden table before him, its rising steam forming a faint, curling mist in the morning light. One hand rested gently on the cup, the other folded loosely across his chest. Sunlight filtered through the wide front windows, casting angular beams across the high bridge of his nose and the sharp cut of his cheekbones, creating a shifting mosaic of shadow and gold on a face I could not look away from. But it wasn't his appearance that held me captive. It was the way he looked at me. Not with curiosity, not with rudeness or flirtation. It was a quiet gaze, steady and unblinking, as if studying me and waiting for something I couldn't yet name. Long minutes passed and still he didn't drink. Then, finally, he spoke. Just a single sentence, but it rang through the café like the sudden toll of a bell. "Who made this coffee?" I was standing no more than 3 paces away, and still I startled. Not because he asked, but because of how he asked. Slowly, calmly. Yet in that calm was a weight that seemed to draw every sound in the room into silence. I swallowed, lifted a hand. I did. I made it. He gave a small nod, his face revealing nothing. Then with deliberate care he raised the cup to his lips and took a sip, a small one. He said nothing more, only lowered the cup again, as if weighing something invisible. I stood still, fingers tightening around the cloth in my hand. No one in the café spoke, but I could feel all eyes watching, discreet and hungry for meaning. The air thickened. Then he looked up at me again, and this time, I noticed the slightest shift in his gaze. It wasn't cold now, not distant. There was something else, something I could only describe as acknowledgement. He didn't smile. But he didn't look away either. I felt in that moment, like I had passed some invisible test I hadn't known I was taking. "Good coffee," he said, "but not like the others. There's something in this one." His words caught me off guard. It was a standard recipe, one I made every day. But maybe what changed it today was the way my hands trembled slightly as I timed the pour. Or maybe it was the thought of my father, the prescription stacking higher than I could afford, that slipped somehow into the pull of the shot. Maybe, in some strange and quiet way, all of that found its way into the cup, and the man across from me tasted it. I didn't answer. I had no words. He didn't need any. He simply looked at me for a few more seconds, then bowed his head slightly, as though the conversation had ended. I stepped back, but my thoughts remained at that table. Something was unfinished. There was a charge in the air, not fear, but a waiting, as if the storm had not yet broken, but the wind had begun to rise. And I knew, with the gut-deep instinct of a woman who has lived through too many turns in the dark, that this morning was far from over. It was only just beginning. When I returned to the counter, my coworker gave me a strange look. "Who was that?" she whispered. I shook my head. "I don't know, but I have a feeling he'll be back, and when he returns, the coffee I make won't be the only thing he's come for." He returned the next morning. Same suit, same eyes that allowed no one the comfort of looking away, same silence that seemed to hush the entire room without a word. But this time, he came alone. No towering men at his side. Just him, walking in with the quiet authority of someone who belonged, not as a guest, but as the one who owned the place. I had just finished rinsing a stack of glasses, hadn't even taken off my apron for the mid-shift break, when I looked up and saw him standing at the counter. His hand rested on the cool marble surface, his voice low and even. "Are you free tonight?" I froze. Not because of the question itself, but because of how he asked it. It wasn't a request, it was a statement, a decision already made. My mind jumped, scrambling for excuses. Evening shift, my father, housework. But he didn't wait for my answer. "I'm not asking you to dinner. I want you to come to my home, to make coffee, just for tonight. There will be guests. I want you to make it exactly the way you did yesterday morning." I stared at him, unsure if I'd heard him right. "Just coffee." He nodded. "And I'll pay $6,000 for the night." This time, I truly had no words. $6,000 for one night of making coffee. The number echoed through my mind like a cathedral bell. I thought of my father's medical bills, the ones the hospital warned last week would be sent to collections. I thought of the breathing machine the doctor said was becoming urgent. I thought of my account balance, barely enough for milk and pain relievers. But this man was a stranger. A man with no history, no name, only eyes heavy with power and a silence that pressed like weight. I had never stepped inside the home of someone wealthy like him. I had certainly never imagined being paid such a sum for something as ordinary as pouring a cup. He saw the hesitation in my face but made no move to sway me. "You don't need to decide now. If you choose to come, a car will pick you up at 7. He placed a card on the counter. Only one name embossed in silver. Luke Moreland. No phone number, no address. I picked up the card as if it were something sacred. My hand trembled slightly. He turned and left without another word. No morning coffee, no explanation. Just left me there, standing behind the counter with a cold business card in my fingers and 1,000 thoughts clawing through my mind. That afternoon, I asked for half a day off. I didn't explain why. Just said I needed to care for my father. The truth was, I needed time to think. By 7 that evening, I could step into a world entirely unknown. It could be safe. It could be dangerous. It could be the chance to breathe, to pay off debt, to buy time for the man who gave me life. Or it could be the kind of trap I'd never walk away from. But $6,000, to me, that wasn't just money. That was a few more weeks of life for my father. That was a few nights of sleep I hadn't had in months. That was a door, swinging open, that I couldn't ignore. And what frightened me most wasn't Luke Moreland. It was how much I already found myself thinking about him. I didn't decide right away. That afternoon, I wandered around the apartment like someone lost, cleaning things that didn't need cleaning, checking my father's pill organizer, then closing it again, preparing his favorite soup only to leave it untouched on the stove. My thoughts circled endlessly around the number 6,000, the amber gaze, the silver-embossed card bearing a single name, and a question I couldn't shake. Why me? I wasn't strikingly beautiful, didn't have any rare barista talent, and I certainly wasn't the kind of woman easily swayed by power. I was just a 39-year-old woman, worn thin by the everyday weight of life, still trying to smile at customers and carry myself through the hours like I wasn't quietly drowning beneath it all. But that evening, when the clock struck 18 minutes past 6, I slipped into a clean coat, tied my hair back neatly, and tucked the business card carefully into my pocket. I left a note on the fridge for my father, telling him I'd be home late and not to worry. Then I stepped out of our small apartment, heart unsteady. A sleek black car was already waiting below. The driver didn't speak much, only confirmed my name and opened the door. As we pulled away from the city, I realized we were heading west, away from the heart of Boston. Long roads stretched ahead, flanked by rows of pines and grand homes hidden behind tall gates and thick stone walls. No one spoke during the 30-minute drive. Only the soft purr of the engine and the flickering of streetlights against the glass accompanied my racing thoughts. Eventually, we pulled up before a tall iron gate, flanked by cameras and motion-activated lights. A quiet beep sounded, and the gate opened slowly. Beyond it, a stone driveway led to a grand 3-story house built in the style of old Europe, with a wide porch, slate-gray roof, and golden lights glowing warmly along the walls. I stepped out of the car, palms slightly damp. The front door opened before I could even reach for the bell. A woman, older, and impeccably dressed in a simple black dress, greeted me with a faint smile. "You must be Grace." I nodded. She introduced herself as Renata, Mr. Moreland's housekeeper. "Come with me. The dinner is about to begin." I followed her through the vast foyer, where polished wooden floors gleamed beneath high ceilings, and a crystal chandelier cast soft light across the walls. A faint scent drifted from the kitchen, a mixture of warm spices, aged wood, and the delicate sweetness of orange peel. In the kitchen, 3 people worked with quiet precision. A man checked the oven, while 2 women arranged plates on silver trays. All of them wore crisp black and white uniforms, moving efficiently and wordlessly. No one asked who I was. No one looked surprised. It was as if my presence here had already been written into the plan. Renata led me to a small room beside the kitchen, where a sleek coffee station stood against the wall, the wood dark and polished, the equipment more advanced than anything I'd used at the café. The beans were already prepped, the same kind I used at work. Renata turned to me. Mr. Moreland wants you to prepare it by hand, just as you did at the café. I nodded, pulled on an apron, wiped my hands, and began. But tonight, I wasn't just making coffee. I was trying to keep my hands from shaking. Somewhere beyond those doors, men were seated around a long table, discussing matters I was likely never meant to hear. And somewhere in this house, a man was waiting to taste again the brew I had made with trembling hands and too many unnamed worries. I didn't know where tonight would lead me. I only knew that when the soft chime signaled dessert was being served, I drew a long breath and placed the first espresso cup on a silver tray, preparing to step into a world where nothing was familiar and nothing was mine to control anymore. I stepped out of the coffee room just as the first notes of a piano floated in from the main hall. The sound was soft, deliberate, almost fragile, but it didn't ease the tension in the air. If anything, it made everything more taut, more poised, like breath held too long. The dining room had been crafted in the style of an old Italian salon, tall walls, ivory silk curtains, and golden light that fell gently across the space like evening sun through amber glass. Around a long table draped in crisp white linen sat 12 men, their movements refined, their silence weighted. Dishes were served one by one, perfectly timed, with the rhythm and restraint of a 5-star ritual. The servers moved like shadows present but unseen. I wasn't there to serve the food. My task was singular and clear: to prepare coffee once the meal was done, and to ensure each cup of espresso reached the table at exactly the right moment, as if part of a script written long before I'd arrived. I didn't know who these men were, but I knew they weren't ordinary businessmen. There were no loud laughs, no casual chatter. Yet each nod, each glance across the table carried the quiet heft of command. At the head of the table, where the flicker of chandelier light met the red hue of his wineglass, Luke Moreland sat in silence, one hand under his chin, his eyes fixed on me from the moment I entered. No one else acknowledged me as I passed, or perhaps they deliberately chose not to. But Luke's gaze didn't waver. It moved with me, like a subtle current beneath my feet, making me grip the silver tray a little tighter than usual. As I approached the head of the table, he gave a faint nod, just enough to let me know his cup should be the first. I placed it gently in front of him, then continued the circuit. No words were spoken, just a bow of the head, the same way I had done for hundreds of customers before. But none of them were like this. Once each man had his cup, I stepped back, as instructed. I was ready to return to the preparation room when Renata appeared at my side, her voice barely a whisper. "Mr. Moreland would like to see you after dinner." Her tone was light, almost casual, but the shift in my heartbeat was immediate. I nodded, keeping my face still. About 30 minutes later, after most of the guests had departed, I was led to a small room tucked behind the main staircase. No guards, no theatrics, just a quiet space with soft light spilling through a window that looked out onto the garden. A single bottle of wine stood uncorked on a table, and Luke sat there without his jacket, his tie loosened. He gestured to the chair across from him, then poured 2 glasses. I still wasn't sure why I was there, but I didn't ask. I waited. He slid 1 glass toward me, but didn't insist I drink it. He simply watched me for a long moment, then spoke. "Do you often accept invitations like tonight's?" His voice held no accusation. It wasn't a trap, just quiet curiosity. I shook my head. This was the first time. He nodded, as if confirming something he already suspected. "I don't need someone to make coffee," he said. "I need someone who sees without asking, who understands without explanations. I need someone like you." I looked at him, confused. He leaned back in his chair, swirling the wine in his glass. "Work for me, as an assistant. No degree required, no resume, just honesty. And silence when needed. The pay will cover your father's care. More than that, you won't be the shadow in someone else's room anymore." For the first time in years, I had no words, not because I was afraid, but because every refusal I might have given felt suddenly meaningless. The room was quiet. Only the ticking of an old wall clock filled the space. And I knew then, whatever answer I gave, it would change everything. I moved into the estate on a fog-draped Monday morning. Boston was just brushing the edge of early autumn, when the air turns damp and cool, and the trees begin their quiet transformation, one golden leaf at a time. I brought with me a single suitcase packed lightly with clothes, a few personal belongings, and a small framed photograph of my father and me from a time when he was still strong, still smiling without effort. Renata greeted me at the door with the same poised smile, her grace as seamless and practiced as ever. She led me up to the 2nd floor, to a modest but well-appointed room just beside Luke's study. It had a window overlooking the back garden, a walnut writing desk near a neatly stocked bookshelf, a single bed dressed in crisp white linen, and a wardrobe already prepared with everything I might need. It wasn't lavish, but it was clean, discreet, and unmistakably intentional. I wasn't a guest. I was something else now. A part of this house, in some unspoken, irreversible way. I began working that very afternoon. The task seemed straightforward at first, reviewing Luke's meeting schedule, responding to correspondence, handling and categorizing incoming calls. But once I started, I realized nothing here was simple. Meetings were never listed with full names. Calls came coded in symbols and phrases I had never encountered. Letters arrived in layered encryption, often passing through multiple hands before reaching Luke's desk. It took me nearly 2 hours just to decipher and organize the schedule for the first 3 days. Every entry had to be exact, with no overlaps, no missed detail. A single error could trigger consequences far beyond what I could see. Luke's office sat at the end of the hall, behind a heavy, soundproofed wooden door. I was only allowed in when summoned, always through Renata. Though I was his personal assistant, he maintained a line of distance as sharp and deliberate as every word he spoke. He never used my name, only gave brief nods when something was needed. His requests were clear, always concise, and carried the weight of absolute authority. Once, I witnessed a closed-door meeting in a secondary lounge where no cameras reached and the curtains were always drawn. The men who arrived wore tailored suits and carried themselves with composure, but their eyes were ice, their voices flat and emotionless. I wasn't allowed to record, to inquire, or even to leave the premises during such meetings. Each day, I reviewed the guest list, arranged the meeting room, ensured water and printed materials were prepared precisely according to designated codes. I had never imagined that someone like Luke Moreland ran a system so vast, so intricate. He never raised his voice. He never needed to. The moment he entered a room, the air changed. Silence followed him like shadow. He controlled everything with restraint and a gaze that never wavered. One evening, I asked Renata quietly, "Who is he, really?" She only smiled and continued polishing a teacup as if she hadn't heard the question at all. I was beginning to understand. This house had rules of its own, and if I wanted to survive here, I would have to learn them all, down to the smallest detail. But more than the silence, the codes, or the weight of secrecy, what unsettled me most was the trust Luke placed in me. He never double-checked my work, never had anyone oversee me. From the beginning, it was as if he knew I would not fail, and in some strange way, that made the pressure even heavier. I didn't know exactly what world I had stepped into, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Once you enter, there is no gentle way back, and I, Grace Hollander, was no longer the woman behind the coffee counter. I had become a part of the machinery, a single, silent cog in the life of the most dangerous man I had ever met. I began watching Luke more closely, not out of idle curiosity, but because there was something in him I simply couldn't look away from. Every morning, at the exact same time, he appeared in his office dressed in dark suits, silk ties, and leather shoes polished to a mirror shine. Every step he took carried a calm, deliberate energy, the kind of control so complete it bordered on coldness. He never spoke more than needed, never rushed, and rarely, if ever, offered a genuine smile. But what caught my attention most weren't his routines, or even his silence. It was the presence of the 2 tall men in black who shadowed him like his own echo. They stayed precisely 3 paces behind him at all times. No one in the house called them bodyguards, but the way they moved, the way they watched everything, the way they positioned themselves quietly in front of any entrance when strangers arrived, told me exactly what they were. I had never seen them speak to anyone but Renata. They never called Luke by name, never left the estate, not once since the day I arrived. One afternoon, while searching for a file Luke had requested, I entered the library before the door had been locked. On the large oak table was an open leather briefcase, barely ajar. Inside, I caught a glimpse of documents stamped in red, a handful of passports under different names, and a black and white photo of a man I didn't recognize. I hadn't even taken a step closer when I heard the soft click of the door closing behind me. Renata stood there, her face calm, neither stern nor startled. "This isn't the place you're meant to be," she said gently. I apologized and backed out immediately. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was afraid, but because, for the first time, the vague suspicions I'd quietly carried began to feel like something real, tangible, breathing around me. Luke Moreland was not just a wealthy man with discreet business interests. He was the center of a network I didn't have the knowledge to name, but I knew it didn't exist within the bounds of any conventional industry. Once, I saw a man mid-50s, gray at the temples, exit Luke's study with a faint smear of blood on the cuff of his shirt. He said nothing, walked straight out. Another man followed, lugging a heavy leather bag. I didn't ask, but from that day on I began noticing something else. Luke's meetings often aligned with the timing of brief, murky reports in local news outlets, stories of disappearances, of middle-tier businessmen vanishing without a trace around the New England area. Some of the names had passed through my inbox not long before, listed in subject lines, coded into calendar notes, so I started paying closer attention. Not to betray him, not to run, but to understand the man I now worked for. Each time I transferred a document, I skimmed the headers. Each time a call came in, I took note of the code flashing on the screen. The more I learned, the blurrier the lines became. Right and wrong began to dissolve into each other like ink in water. Luke never raised his voice. He never issued threats. He never gave me a reason to fear him, but he never needed to. His power wasn't in what he said. It was in the way no one ever said no to him. At dinner, he was polite. At work, he was focused. But there was always space around him, always a distance no one crossed. Not even me. There was a wall between Luke and the rest of the world, and I didn't know if I wanted to be on the other side of it. Some nights, I would sit by my window and watch the light spill from under his office door, wondering how lonely a man like that must be. And maybe that was the most dangerous thought of all, because the moment I stopped thinking of him as just my employer, everything around me began to shift. I began to notice a change in the way Luke looked at me. It was no longer the quiet, measured gaze of a man assessing an employee, but something deeper, layered, as if he were slowly unlocking the doors that had kept a distance between us. It wasn't in any particular gesture that I could point to, but in the weight of silence when we were alone in a room together. Silence that used to feel like the stillness of work now carried something else entirely, something that made it impossible to ignore. Each time I entered his office with documents, his eyes lingered on me for just a few seconds longer. When I brought him coffee, he would ask a question, soft, unnecessary, just enough to keep me in the room a moment more. Taken on their own, those moments might seem like nothing, but together, they formed a quiet pattern, a slow approach, a presence that edged closer with every passing day, and it left my heart off balance, not from fear, but from the growing truth that I wasn't sure I was ready. One evening, after I had just finished reviewing his schedule for the coming week, Renata came to find me. She said Luke had asked for me to join him for dinner. Not a formal meal, just something simple, in his private dining room. I hesitated. There was no reason to refuse, but there was also no reason for it to happen. I had never shared a meal with him, not even sat at the same table except during strictly professional meetings. Still, I said yes. When I stepped into the room, the lights had been dimmed to a soft, golden glow. The table was set for two, a bottle of wine was already open, and the scent of roasted meat drifted warmly through the air. Luke stood by the window, one hand in his pocket, dressed in his usual dark suit, though tonight he wore no tie. He turned when I entered, gave a small nod in place of greeting, then pulled out a chair for me. The meal began in silence. I didn't know how to start. He didn't seem in any hurry. We ate slowly, each of us adrift in our own thoughts, though something unspoken hovered between us. By the time dessert was served, Luke set down his fork, looked directly at me, and spoke. "I don't only need your skills." The words made me look up, my pulse quickening. I didn't yet understand the weight behind them. He continued, "You understand the work. You're discreet. You watch without needing everything explained. But lately, I've felt that's no longer enough." I stayed quiet. I didn't know how far he meant to go. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear where it would lead. But I didn't look away. And for the first time, in Luke's eyes, I didn't see control. I saw something closer to vulnerability, to hope. "I don't know how to begin," he admitted. "I'm used to giving orders, not offering explanations. But I know that if I don't say this, I'll lose something I'm not ready to let go of." I couldn't count how many breaths I took just to keep still. His words weren't many, and they weren't rushed, but they cracked something in me I had worked hard to hold together. I had seen the shadows that followed him. I had heard strange phone calls, seen men leave the estate with tension written across their faces. I knew what Luke Moreland was capable of, but tonight, when I looked into his eyes, I didn't see those shadows. I saw a man trying to speak a truth the only way he knew how. And that strangely, deeply frightened me more than any quiet threat ever could, because if I let myself take one step closer, I knew there would be no turning back. I never imagined myself stepping into a charity gala as the woman beside Luke Moreland. But that's exactly where I found myself on a Saturday evening, less than a week after that quiet dinner in his private dining room. He didn't exactly ask me. He simply said there was an important event in the business community, and he needed me to accompany him. There was no command in his words, but there was also no room to decline. When I descended the grand staircase of the estate, wearing the long black gown Renata had carefully laid out the night before, I saw Luke waiting at the base of the stairs. He wore a tuxedo, crisp white shirt, and a perfectly knotted black tie, not a single crease out of place. He looked at me for a moment, nodded slightly, and extended his hand. No compliments were given, but in his gaze was something steady and unwavering that made my heart stumble. We traveled in a private car, flanked by 2 others behind us. The presence of his security was nothing new to me, but tonight, the tension felt different. He said little during the ride. One hand rested on his knee, fingers tapping in a soft, even rhythm on the fabric of his trousers. His expression remained composed, but there was a stillness in his eyes, a silence heavier than usual. When the car pulled through the gates of a luxury hotel in the heart of the city, I saw rows of high-end vehicles already lined up. Flashbulbs flickered across the entrance like bursts of lightning. Murmurs rose from clusters of guests already gathering near the front steps. The driver opened Luke's door first. He stepped out, then turned and offered me his hand. The moment I emerged, the light struck my face. The clicking of cameras came in waves, and I realized this was no ordinary event. Luke's hand rested gently on the small of my back as we moved through the crowd and into the grand lobby. He didn't speak, only nodded faintly to a few familiar faces, but no one dared step too close. Inside, the chandeliers spilled crystal light across the soaring ceilings. Champagne flowed freely. A string quartet played delicate notes that seemed to dissolve into the thick, refined air. Everything was exquisite, curated to perfection and suffocating in its elegance. Luke didn't introduce me to anyone. He simply stood beside me, his hand still lightly behind my back, a quiet signal to the room that I was with him. I caught a few glances cast my way, some curious, others calculated. A few women stared as if trying to place me, or understand why I stood where they only dared to watch from a distance. I wasn't focused on them. I was watching Luke. And the more I watched, the more I realized his silence tonight was not the calm I had come to know. It was something more exacting, focused, the kind of quiet that belongs to a man who knows exactly how many eyes are on him and how many knives may be hidden behind polite smiles. He didn't drink the wine in his hand, just held the glass, untouched. Every time someone approached, his eyes tracked their movement before they arrived, scanning, measuring, anticipating. I leaned in and whispered, "Is something wrong?" He didn't answer right away. Then he turned, his voice low and firm. "Don't leave my side, no matter what happens." The words were colder than any order he had ever given. I nodded, forcing calm into my breath even as something inside me tensed. I understood now this wasn't just a gala. It was a chessboard. Behind the music, behind the laughter and the glinting glass, something was moving. Power was shifting. And somehow, without warning, I had been placed beside the most dangerous king on that board. It all happened in less than a minute. We were standing near the bar area, and Luke's eyes were still sweeping the room, his gaze moving with the precision of someone silently counting the steps of strangers. I was just about to ask if he wanted to leave early when the sharp sound of glass shattering cut through the hum of conversation. A wine glass had fallen. Or maybe it was a signal. Before I could even turn my head, the first explosion sounded. Not loud, not violent, but sharp enough to freeze the room mid-breath. Then came another strange sound. A flicker of the chandelier overhead, the lights dimmed, sputtering, then screaming. At the far end of the hall, a woman collapsed. Blood began to spread across the white marble floor beneath her. Someone shouted for the police. The air shattered in an instant. Guests scattered in every direction. Trays fell. Silverware clattered. Wine splashed like ink across gowns and tuxedos. I had never witnessed chaos like this. And right in the center of it all, Luke didn't move. He stepped once, just once, to stand directly in front of me. I couldn't hear his voice, but I felt the sudden grip of his hand on my arm, pulling me hard toward the back hallway. A side door burst open. Mike, Luke's driver, was already there. But he wasn't wearing a suit tonight, just a black shirt, his eyes scanning the corridor, sharp and alert. He didn't hesitate. His voice cut through the noise behind us. "Get her out, now." "That was all," Luke said. Firm, final, no space for argument. I stammered, trying to resist. "What about you?" But he didn't answer. He just turned me toward Mike, then stepped back. I saw the flash of something in his hand, pulled from his jacket. It wasn't a phone. I didn't need to see clearly to understand. Mike didn't give me time to think. He grabbed my arm and practically lifted me into a run through the narrow service hallway and down the emergency stairwell. The sound of footsteps pounded behind us. Somewhere above, metal struck tile. Another blast rang out closer this time. I turned, but Mike blocked me. "Don't look. We have to get to the car." Everything blurred in the faint haze of smoke rising from the floors below. By the time we burst into the parking lot, the black SUV was already waiting. Engine running, back doors open. Mike threw the door wide, pushed me inside, then climbed in himself, the tires shrieking as he sped away from the curb. I twisted in my seat, looking back. Behind us, the hotel glowed in the strobe of emergency lights, red, blue, spinning across broken glass and scattered gowns, but no sign of Luke. I called his name. Mike didn't answer. I shouted again. "Where is he?" Mike's knuckles tightened around the wheel. His voice came out rough. He stayed behind. I whispered, my voice barely a sound. "Why?" He didn't turn. "He knew if you were both caught, neither of you would survive. He told me to get you out. Only you. No one else." Something inside me went cold, as if the air had been pulled from my lungs. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with a raw, rising panic of another kind. There was no news, no signal, no voice on the other end of the line. Only the memory of a look, a hand wrapped around mine just a minute ago, and a silence that now filled the space he once stood in. I sat motionless for the rest of the drive, the inside of the car quiet except for the hum of the road and the wind slipping past the windows. I couldn't tear my eyes from the darkness beyond the glass, and for the first time since I stepped into Luke Moreland's world, I was afraid not of what he'd done, but of what it would mean if he never came back, and of the terrible, hollow truth that I didn't know how to go on without him. 3 days passed in a silence so heavy it felt like the walls of the house themselves were holding their breath. The estate sank into a stillness that was almost reverent. No phones rang, no footsteps hurried. Conversations were brief, hushed, as if any loud sound might shatter something too fragile to name. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I sat in the living room and watched the rain fall endlessly onto the garden, a cold, ceaseless curtain that refused to lift. Mike moved back and forth through the hallway, his eyes sunken, jaw clenched, saying nothing. The news on television spoke of the attack at the gala, of a gunfight between 2 unidentified groups, but there was no mention of Luke, no name, no photo, just a terrifying silence where his presence should have been. On the 3rd night, when I was too exhausted to even feel anymore, my head resting against the back of the armchair, I heard a car pulling up at the front gate. At first, I thought I imagined it, but then came the sound of the door, heavy footsteps, the creak of damp shoes on tile. Mike rushed outside, and I heard his voice low, shaking. Then another voice responded. Hoarse, faint, but so familiar my heart stopped beating altogether. "Luke." I ran to the entryway, my legs numb beneath me, and there he was, standing in the foyer, blood on his shirt, a bandage hastily wrapped around his shoulder, his face pale, eyes sharp but dimmed by exhaustion. He saw me and spoke just one quiet sentence. "I'm sorry I was late. I don't remember what I did first. I only know that I ran to him and threw my arms around him so tightly he let out a soft groan of pain. But he didn't push me away. His free arm wrapped around me, trembling with exhaustion, holding me like he had come back for this moment alone. His body was cold, like someone who had just walked through a storm and left half of himself behind in it. I looked up, my face wet with tears I hadn't even noticed. "I thought you were dead." He looked at me, and the distance that had always lived behind his eyes softened. He didn't speak. He only lifted his hand, touched my cheek, his fingers brushing the tears away, and gave a slow, solemn nod. He nearly collapsed as Mike helped him up the stairs. I followed, quietly, to his room where Renata had already laid out supplies, clean dressings, painkillers, a bowl of warm water. Luke let Mike unbutton his shirt and redress the wound, saying nothing. I stood to the side and watched, my throat closing as I saw the bruises across his ribs, the angry scrapes on his back, the dark mark blooming over his side like a shadow that refused to fade. When the others left and the door closed behind them, we were alone. He sat on the edge of the bed, breathing unevenly. I stepped forward, meaning to say something, anything, but his voice stopped me. "You cried for me." I didn't deny it. I couldn't. He reached for my hand. His was still streaked with dried blood. His grip was weak but certain. "I didn't think I'd make it back," he whispered. But in that moment, all I could think about was your face, and those words undid me. My knees gave out. I sank beside him as more tears spilled, unbidden, unstoppable. He pulled me gently into his arms, and though his body was worn and trembling, his embrace held a strength that quieted every sound in the world. I pressed my ear to his shoulder, listening to the uneven rhythm of his heartbeat beneath the gauze. I don't remember who leaned in first. I only remember the moment his mouth found mine, slow, certain, a confirmation that he was still alive, that we were both still here. The fear slipped away. The distance dissolved. There was only the truth, raw and wordless. I loved him. No part of my life had prepared for that. And yet, in his arms, it was the only thing that made sense. Outside, the rain kept falling, soft, persistent, a steady rhythm against the glass. And in that quiet room, we reached for each other not with desperation, but with the ache of two people who had gone too far to turn back. I don't remember how many words we shared. I only remember his eyes when he looked at me filled with pain, weariness, and a tenderness so deep it made my heart ache. When dawn broke, I lay in his arms, listening to the breath of a man I had feared gone forever. And in that fragile light, I knew with a certainty that went deeper than fear or reason, that no matter what might come, no matter how the world around us fell apart, I had chosen my path, and I would walk it beside him. After that night, nothing was the same. I was no longer just his personal assistant, silently orbiting his world from a measured distance. I became the one beside him when he woke in the middle of the night, breath caught in his throat from pain that still lingered deep in his shoulder. I brewed tea for him on quiet mornings, before the house stirred, and sat beside him while we read through confidential documents that needed no explanation and invited no questions. There was no spoken agreement between us, no formal acknowledgement of what we had become. I lived like a partner without a title, a presence unnamed but undeniably necessary. Renata began to treat me differently. Her tone softened. Sometimes she set out my favorite dessert after dinner without saying a word. Mike, too, eased the rigid lines around his gaze. He no longer avoided my eyes. Once or twice, he even greeted me with a glance that felt almost like respect. But all of it, every gesture, every moment of warmth, existed only within the thick walls of that estate, a place ruled by its own quiet order, where I belonged, and yet where my name was never truly spoken aloud. The outside world still existed, and in it, there was my father. He was still recovering at the care facility Luke had arranged, now upgraded with better service, more attentive doctors, and bills that were paid promptly, without ever crossing my desk. Every Wednesday afternoon, Luke gave me space to go see him, a pocket of peace carved out in a life otherwise filled with shadows. He looked better, stronger. He could sit up now, read books again, speak with that calm voice I'd known since childhood, his eyes carrying a glint of the man he used to be. He always asked how I was doing, how work was going, and I always smiled. I told him just enough to ease his mind, that I worked for a difficult but fair employer, that I was well paid, that I lived in a house with a garden, that I was okay. But I couldn't tell him about the nights I stayed awake next to that same man, watching the faint rise and fall of his chest as he tried to sleep through the pain. I couldn't tell him I had touched blood on skin still healing, that I had kissed wounds that would never fully disappear, that I had fallen asleep in arms that felt more like home than any place I'd ever known. I couldn't tell him I'd nearly lost that man, and each time I stepped out of the care center, I carried with me a weight I couldn't shake. Guilt not for what I felt, but for what I couldn't say. I was hiding things from my father, the man who raised me with tenderness and unflinching integrity, the man who taught me that real love never rests on a foundation of lies. And yet, here I was, living two lives, one as the dutiful daughter responsible, steady, visiting every week, and the other as the woman who woke each morning in a world without borders between right and wrong, a woman who loved a man she wasn't sure would ever step fully into the light, a man who might never belong to the world my father dreamed I'd one day call home. There were nights I lay beside Luke, watching him sleep, wondering when, if this would all collapse, wondering if a day would come when I'd have to choose between him and the rest of my life, between truth and love, between peace and the fire we'd ignited. But then morning would come, and I would see him sitting in his leather chair, the early light casting soft shadows on his face, the scar along his jaw still healing, still raw, and in that moment, I could not leave, because loving a man like Luke Moreland is not a gentle decision. It is a choice made daily, a deliberate act, and every day, I am still choosing him, even as I carry a quiet, aching space inside me, one I have no idea how to fill. I was beginning to realize that the danger in Luke's world was no longer something abstract, no longer the soft hum of unease I had grown used to. It had taken shape now, sharp and undeniable, as clear as the cold glint in the eyes of the men who came to the estate on nights when nothing appeared on the official schedule. They arrived without warning in dark, unmarked cars just as the light began to fade. They never stayed long. 20 minutes, maybe 30, before they vanished again into the dusk, leaving behind no records, no signatures, only the echo of conversations never meant to be remembered. No recordings, no contracts, just quiet handshakes, and a tension that lingered in the air long after the doors closed. I still made Luke his coffee, still organized his calendar, his files, still walked beside him at the events where every guest smiled with their mouths but said nothing with their eyes. But I could no longer ignore the growing certainty that everything around us was poised on the edge of collapse. Some mornings, I'd wake earlier than usual, go down to the kitchen, and find faint streaks of blood wiped hurriedly from the stone floor. Once, I opened a drawer that had always held nothing more than paper and ink, and found a disassembled handgun lying in neat pieces among the folders. Another night, searching for painkillers in the storage room, I overheard Renata speaking urgently on the phone, her voice low and strained in Italian. When I entered, she stopped mid-sentence and greeted me with a practiced smile, but her eyes, always warm before, now held something watchful, measured. Mike had begun to follow me more closely whenever I left the house. He no longer kept a discreet distance. Now he waited in plain sight, parked directly outside the pharmacy, trailing me into bookshops, even small cafes. I knew he meant no harm. He was doing his job, but I also knew this shift hadn't come from him, not without Luke's word. And that's when I began to understand that my presence in Luke's life was no longer just a private matter. I had become a vulnerability, a liability, a thread someone could pull if they wanted to unravel everything. I still loved him. That had never changed. But now, that love came wrapped in a quiet, constant dread. Every time Luke left the estate, I sat in the living room, watching my phone like it held my breath. Minutes stretched like hours. Every time he came home late, I forced myself not to call, because I knew if he could answer, he would. I spoke less, chose my words more carefully. I stopped asking about the men whose names crossed my desk. I didn't bring up the news articles about the missing, the bankrupt, the scandals that whispered through the city like smoke. But I read them all. I remembered them, not to accuse him, but to better understand the man I had chosen to stay beside. Some nights, when he finally slept, I would touch his hand gently, trace the small scar that ran down to his wrist. I didn't know where it had come from. Just like I didn't know how many things he kept from me, not to deceive, maybe, but perhaps to protect, or to make sure I stayed. I never asked him if he intended to change, because I understood once you've lived inside this world, it's never easy to leave. And I, Grace Hollander, a woman who once only knew the scent of morning coffee and the weight of unpaid medical bills, now found myself lying in the quiet, hairline fractures of a life where love and danger breathed in sync with every heartbeat. It was no longer a matter of how deep I was in. I already knew the answer to that. The only question now was how long it could last before something broke. It started with the smallest of things. A strange look from a man in the neighborhood pharmacy. A gray car parked across the street from my usual morning route, its engine running but no one stepping out. A moment of absolute certainty that someone was standing just behind me as I turned into the narrow lane leading to the estate. I've never been the kind of woman who lets fear cloud her thoughts. But I was no longer the woman who once knew only the hum of a coffee machine and the comfort of an hourly wage. I had learned how to remember license plates, to check mirrors twice, to keep my phone fully charged and tucked in the inside pocket of my coat. At first, I didn't tell Luke. Part of me wasn't sure it was real. Maybe it was just my growing anxiety, the weight of everything we'd stepped into finally catching up with me. But then the envelope came. There was no return address, just a single photograph. A picture of me taken from behind standing in front of my father's care facility. That's when I knew. This wasn't chance. This wasn't paranoia. When I handed the photo to Luke, he didn't yell. He didn't flinch. He stared at it for a long time, fingers gripping the edge like he could crush it with pressure alone. Then he folded it in half, slid it into his desk drawer, and closed it. When he looked up, something in his face had shifted. It was a coldness I'd only seen when he was forced to confront people who would never earn a second chance. "He's back," Luke said quietly. The words were flat, hollow. I didn't ask who. I didn't need to know the name. I could feel the storm already beginning to gather around us. And this time, I wasn't on the outside looking in. I was the target. Mike began checking the car every morning. 2 new guards were added to the estate. They followed at a steady 3-step distance whenever I left the house. Renata no longer stayed out more than 30 minutes on her errands. No one said anything. But the rhythm of the household changed, moving with the silent urgency of people who had lived through danger before and now recognized its scent in the air. But I was the only part of the machine that still didn't know how to move. I was scared, not for myself, for my father, for Luke, for the people who, somehow, now counted on me. I saw the fatigue settling deeper in Luke's eyes each night. I noticed how his conversations with Mike became shorter, sharper. He didn't want to just respond. He wanted to end it. When I finally asked, he told me the man was once an ally, a name within the same circle, someone who had disappeared in silence only to return now, and not without reason. Whatever that reason was, only Luke understood it fully. I knew he wasn't keeping secrets out of distrust. He was protecting me, for as long as he could, but that wasn't possible anymore. One evening, I was folding clothes in the quiet of our room when he came in without a word. He stood there for a long moment, watching me. Then, in a voice low and raw, he said, "You can leave. I'll take care of everything. I'll move you and your father somewhere safe, somewhere no one will find you. All the paperwork, the cost, the travel. I'll handle it. You won't have to come back here." I set the shirt in my hands down and looked up at him. And in that single moment, I knew I'd made my decision long before he ever opened his mouth. I stepped forward, took his hand, and held it tight. "I'm not going anywhere." Luke looked at me as if waiting for me to change my mind, hoping maybe I'd choose the easier path. But I didn't waver. I couldn't not after everything. I didn't want to run. I wanted to stay. With him. Not because I was brave, but because real love isn't the quiet sacrifice made from a safe distance. It's the choice to stay, knowing the storm will come. And I, Grace Hollander, had made that choice. With all the fear that still lived inside me, and with all my heart. The retaliation began on a Tuesday night, under a soft, steady rain that draped over Boston like a veil, and everything inside the estate felt strangely calm, too calm, in a way that made the silence feel rehearsed. I was sitting in the library, flipping through the pages of a book I wasn't really reading, when the lights in the house went out, just like that. No warning, no explosion, only a sudden suffocating silence that swallowed every sound. A second later, the emergency lighting flickered on, casting everything in a dim red glow. Mike appeared in the doorway. He said nothing, just motioned for me to get up and follow him. I didn't ask questions. I didn't need to. I already knew whatever had been circling us these past few weeks had finally arrived. We moved through a back hallway I had never been allowed to enter before. Beneath the stone floor, a steel door slid open and revealed a secured basement, low ceilings, reinforced walls, and a wall of security screens, showing live feeds from every inch of the estate. On one of them, I saw 4 men dressed in black moving past the perimeter fence. They moved like shadows, swift and precise. Mike slipped a headset over his ear and spoke quickly, too quietly for me to make out the words. His face remained unchanged. Cold, exact, focused. I sat silently, hands clutching the fabric of my sweater, eyes fixed on the screens. When Luke entered the room, I barely recognized him. No tailored suit, no softened gaze. His face was stone, sharp and unrelenting. His voice dropped low, clipped into commands. He moved like a man built for this exact moment. No hesitation, no doubt. He gave a series of orders to one of the guards standing by, then turned to me. "You stay here. No matter what happens, don't come out." I couldn't speak. I just nodded, my hands trembling as the steel door closed behind him, leaving me locked behind the real life of the man I loved. I watched everything from the safety of that red-lit room. The sound of gunfire came in scattered bursts, punctuated by tense stretches of quiet that were almost worse. I saw Luke, dressed in black, moving through the estate like it was muscle memory, not avoiding danger, meeting it head-on. He didn't just give commands. He fought. He bled. At one point, I saw him pull a wounded guard out of the line of fire, dragging him into the shelter of a hallway before turning back, as if he had nothing left to lose but still no permission to stop. His sleeve was torn, blood seeping down from his shoulder, but he kept moving, kept fighting, and I sat there, my heart twisting into something I didn't recognize, a painful knot of horror and awe. I had known he wasn't just a man of wealth or quiet power. I had seen the bruises, heard the fragments of late-night calls, but nothing had prepared me for this, for the sheer brutality he would willingly enter to protect what was his. The attack lasted nearly 2 hours. The intruders were taken alive, some injured, none successful. Whatever they had come for, they didn't get it. I didn't ask what it was. I didn't want to know. When Luke returned to the room where I was waiting, his shirt was soaked with blood, and his face was so pale I thought he might fall. But before I could say a word, I ran to him, threw my arms around him, held him as if the touch of my skin could pull him back from wherever he had just been. He said nothing, just exhaled, slow and shuddering, and buried his face into my hair. In that moment, all his walls collapsed, not with words, but with the weight of his body leaning into mine, like he didn't know how to be held, but needed it more than breath. I didn't ask for explanations. I had seen all I needed, and in that darkness, I saw not just the ruthlessness of a man who would do whatever it took to defend his ground, but also the fierce, unshakable loyalty he reserved for what he deemed worthy of it. And me, I could no longer deny it. I was one of those things. I sat watching Luke sleep, the dim light from the bedside lamp casting soft shadows across his face, still etched with the weariness of the night before. His arm was wrapped in fresh bandages, his breath steady and deep, but each time he shifted, his brow furrowed as if even in sleep, he was wrestling some unseen ache. I had lain beside him all night, too afraid to close my eyes. Instead, I listened to the ticking of the clock and let my thoughts spiral, circling the same question over and over, like a bird trapped in a room with no open window. Just after dawn, when the birds began to stir in the garden, I slipped out of bed, pulled a silk robe around my shoulders, and stepped onto the balcony. The cold morning air hit my skin and cleared the haze in my mind, and I knew I couldn't go on like this. Not because I didn't love him, but because I was beginning to fear that very love was pulling me into a place where, in the end, all that remained would be loss. When Luke finally came into the dining room, I was already sitting there, my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He saw me and paused, his eyes narrowing, reading something different in the way I sat, the way I didn't lift my gaze to greet him. He said nothing. He poured his coffee and took the seat across from me. I took a breath, looked up. I want to leave. The words broke the silence like a blade drawn across glass. Luke didn't respond right away. He set his cup down gently, his fingers tapping once against the surface of the table, his eyes fixed on mine. Because you're afraid of me. Or afraid of yourself. I shook my head, my voice lower than it had ever been. I'm not afraid of you, and I don't regret staying. But I can't keep living with the feeling that I'm always one step away from losing you. I don't know what tomorrow will bring. I don't know if, when you walk out that door, you'll ever walk back in. And that uncertainty is hollowing me out, one piece at a time. He leaned back in his chair, silent for a long while, his eyes distant, searching for something inside himself. Then he nodded, slowly. I understand. You have the right to peace. You never belonged to this world, Grace. You came into it because of a cup of coffee, and it should have ended there. But then he looked up, and there was something in his eyes I couldn't name, something deep and raw, something only a man like him could carry quietly for so long. Whether you go or stay, I'll protect you. Whether you're 100 miles away or just in the next room, I'll make sure no one can reach you, because you're the only person I can't afford to lose. My throat tightened, because I knew he meant every word. If I left, he would ensure my safety. He would give me everything: comfort, security, distance, and he would watch from afar, never letting me know, never letting me feel the weight of it. And that was what made the space between us feel suddenly, devastatingly wide. I looked at him for a long time before I spoke. I need time. I need space to breathe as myself, not as someone watched, not as someone you have to protect every second. I need to know if I am still anyone at all, without you. Luke didn't stop me. He didn't argue. He stood, walked over, and placed a soft kiss on my forehead, the kind of kiss that says goodbye without needing words. He didn't ask when I'd return. He didn't make me promise anything. And that silence, that quiet acceptance was what broke me, because I understood then that sometimes real love doesn't hold on. Sometimes it lets go, not out of weakness, but out of the deepest strength, to let the person you love find their way, even if it means walking alone, even if it means letting them go into a space where your shadow no longer reaches. I left the estate on an autumn morning, when the trees lining the quiet avenue had just begun to turn. My luggage was light, just a canvas bag and a few worn clothes. Mike walked me to the gate, saying nothing, only watching me with a look that said he already knew I would return. Luke didn't come out to say goodbye. He let me go in silence, with the quiet respect he had promised me from the beginning. In the days that followed, I lived in a small apartment on the south side of the city, not far from my father's care facility. I woke each morning and made coffee by hand, sat alone in the bakery below my building with a book I rarely turned the pages of, and tried to build a life that resembled something ordinary, something like what I had before he ever walked into my world. I visited my father more often, told him gentle lies about a new job, about a kind boss, about a steady life. He never asked too much, and I never gave more than I had to. I had promised not to let him be dragged into the shadows I had once stood inside, and I was still trying to keep that promise. But the more I tried to separate myself from that past, the more I felt like I was living someone else's life. I didn't sleep well. I didn't laugh like I meant it. And even though no one was following me anymore, I still checked over my shoulder at every familiar corner. One morning, I saw a man on the other side of the street with a frame like Luke's, his posture familiar enough to still my heart. I crossed to him, breath caught, but when he turned, he was just a stranger. I walked away quietly, but inside, the ache swelled. I thought I left to find myself again, to figure out whether what I felt for Luke was born from fear, from circumstance, or just some illusion born of adrenaline and desperation. But then I realized real love doesn't need a defense. It exists. It lingers, even when we wish it wouldn't. It becomes part of your breath, your bloodstream. I loved him. Not because he was strong, not because he protected me, not because he paid for my father's care without ever needing thanks. I loved him because in a world where everything was uncertain, his eyes always found me first. Because before I could say I was afraid, his hand was already shielding me. Because he never promised to change, but he always kept his word when he said he'd protect me. And because in his world of cold calculations and careful masks, what he gave me was the one thing that never felt like a transaction. It was real. A week later, I went back. The gate opened as quietly as it had the first time I arrived. Only now there was no hesitation, no sense of trespass. I belonged there, no matter how many times I'd tried to deny it. Renata met me at the door with a calm smile, not surprised at all. She simply said the room hadn't been cleared out. She had a feeling I'd return. Mike appeared from the garage, nodded in place of a greeting, then turned away as if this too had already been accounted for. I climbed the stairs with a strange flutter in my chest. I stopped outside the door I knew by heart. I didn't knock. I pushed it open. Luke was at his desk, back turned. When he heard the door, he looked up. Our eyes met and held for a few long seconds that said more than any words could. He didn't ask why I came back, and I didn't offer to explain. I crossed the room, placed my hand gently on his shoulder, and said just one thing: I'm not leaving again. He closed his eyes, like he'd been holding his breath every day I'd been gone, and could only now exhale. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Because some things, if they've weathered the storm and are still standing, don't need vows or guarantees. They simply are. Like the love I carried for Luke Moreland. And the choice I made this time not out of need, not out of obligation, but because my heart had never truly wanted to be anywhere else. 6 months passed with a strange kind of swiftness. The chaos that once shadowed every step of our days had faded, replaced by a quiet rhythm that felt, in its own way, like peace. There were no more restless nights filled with the dread of what might come. No more wary glances exchanged in the long halls of the estate. Everything had settled into its own steady orbit, slow and deliberate, as if even time had agreed to take a gentler pace. My father recovered fully after his last round of physical therapy. He could walk on his own again, leaning lightly on a cane, his memory no longer scattered, and his voice had regained that familiar low warmth I'd feared lost forever. The day he left the care facility to move in with me, the sky was a clear blue, and the scent of pine filled the road leading back to the estate. He never asked why I lived in a place so grand, never questioned who Luke was. He simply sat by the window in the living room, a cup of tea in his hand, gazing out at the garden like a man who understood some truths were better left unspoken. Luke welcomed him with a quiet grace. No pretense, no attempt to impress, just a man old enough to know that the only way to begin anything real was with patience. The two of them didn't talk much, but during those shared dinners, I could see my father listening, really listening, as if trying to measure the depth of the man his daughter had chosen. And in the silent nods he gave at the end of each meal, I felt the quiet weight of trust slowly being placed, piece by piece, into Luke's hands. I continued the work I had always done. I still managed his schedule, still coordinated the closed-door meetings, still prepared his coffee each morning and set out his files each night before he returned upstairs. But something had changed. The tension that once clung to the edges of every routine was gone. The fear that used to surge with the sound of a car approaching the gate had dissipated. There were no more shadows slipping past the window, no more phantom threats lurking in silence. Luke, too, was different. His work remained what it was demanding, unpredictable, and edged with danger. But he carved out time now. For me. For my father. Some nights, the three of us would sit outside on the back terrace after dinner, listening to jazz from the old speaker my father had brought with him, while Luke read the paper with a glass of brandy in hand. It wasn't the kind of life I had dreamed of, because truthfully, I'd stopped dreaming a long time ago. But it was real, and it was ours. One evening I asked Luke how long he thought this would last. He didn't answer right away. He just reached across the table, took my hand, and held it tightly. Then, in that quiet voice I had come to know better than my own, he said, "Anything can change, but not love." And somehow, in the simplicity of those words, I understood everything I had once needed to know. The future might still hold its storms, but this stillness, this safety, this belonging, was real. It was earned. We had survived the wind and the fire, and now we were learning how to live in the quiet mornings, in the birdsong outside the windows, in the scent of toast and fresh coffee drifting from the kitchen. I was no longer the barista girl who feared her rent and the sleepless dark. I was Grace Hollander, a woman who chose to love a man wrapped in shadows, and in doing so, had turned that love into something warm enough to light the darkest corners of his life. And my father, the very reason I once fought to keep going, is now the one who smiles the most at breakfast. He once told me that a home isn't built from bricks and cement, but from the peace of knowing you've come to the place where you truly belong. Now I understand what he meant. That place is here. In our world. In this home where love doesn't have to hide, and no one has to run in order to survive. That morning, Boston was unusually chilly and quiet. The early sunlight was just warm enough for me to bring my cup of hot coffee out to the porch. My father was sitting on the other side of the table reading the newspaper, his glasses slipping down his nose, while Luke stood leaning against the doorframe, holding his usual cup of black tea. The morning rays filtered through the trees in the front yard, casting a golden hue on his light brown hair. I sat down and took a deep breath, the scent of coffee mixed with the smell of wooden floors and damp grass, quieting my heart in that moment. No more sirens, no more emergency calls in the middle of the night, no more feeling like I was living on the edge between love and danger. There was only one thing left: peace. I turned to look at him. Luke sat down beside me, resting his hand on the back of my chair, a habit formed without reason. I smiled, looked at him for a long while, and softly said, "No regrets." He didn't respond right away. He just gently squeezed my hand, his eyes still fixed on the sunlight spreading across the lawn, then whispered, "Welcome home." In that moment, I knew we had truly returned. Returned to the place where hearts can rest after every storm. My story, Grace Hollander's story, isn't a fairy tale. It's the real journey of a woman who once felt alone, once exhausted from the burden of family, and then stepped into a world she never thought she belonged to. I didn't find love in glitter or grandeur, but in unspoken kindness, in silent loyalty, and in the eyes of a man who seemed cold to the world but never once let me fight alone. This story isn't just about love. It's about the courage to keep going when everything around you is trying to break you. It's a reminder that no matter who you are, no matter what you've been through, you still deserve a place to call home, a place where you're truly loved and never have to hide who you are. If you're hearing these words, and you've ever been a woman carrying the weight of family responsibilities alone, whether caring for your parents or raising your children, I hope Grace's story touches your heart. Though this story isn't about a mother, it speaks to the heart of a woman in a way that many single mothers will understand. The loneliness, the strength, and the unconditional love. And if you feel this story means something to you, please leave a comment below. Tell me what resonates with your life, or share your thoughts so we can connect through honesty. Don't forget to hit subscribe, like, and share the Dear Single Mom YouTube channel so you can keep listening to emotional, inspiring stories every day. We always look forward to hearing how you feel, not just to tell more stories, but to understand that somewhere, within each of us, there's a part of one another. Goodbye for now, and see you in the next video. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, joyful days, a peaceful mind, and a light heart with every step forward. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.